Hello and welcome to Full Tech Ahead. I'm your host, Amanda Razani, and with me today I have Andrew Wertkin. He is the Chief Strategy Officer of BlueCat. How are you doing?
I'm doing super. How about yourself?
Doing well. Can you share a little bit about yourself, your background, and what does BlueCat do?
Sure. So I've been at BlueCat for over a decade now. I joined as our CTO and head of products, and as we continued to scale, we were a much smaller company back then. I decided to put most of my focus on where we're going, and we brought in an amazing CTO to take over the tech side. But I have a long history in B2B enterprise software, both sort of at the network level, but also at higher level at the application level. I've been doing this for 30 years or so and really just trying to find ways to solve business problems to create value with technology for our customers.
Wonderful. Well, our topic for today is enablement, optimization, and security of business networks to meet evolving business demands. So I'm sure you have a lot to share in that regard. Let's start off with how are enterprise network architectures evolving to keep pace with rapid digital transformation efforts today, especially as organizations adopt hybrid and multi-cloud environments.
Yeah, it's been quite a journey, and now more than ever, and I'm sure we'll get there on the AI side. But just as companies started adopting more and more technology from a cloud perspective, as they're trying to enact their digital transformation strategies to create more value, to have more access to data from their products and services, so they can create derivative business models and everything else they're trying to do, requires oftentimes it just sort of breaks down to rapid change. The network needs to be way more flexible than it's ever been. And companies are struggling with how, going from like planned change windows where any sort of significant changes were sort of bulked up and made with, core process around testing to make sure they worked, and how are we going to back it out if it didn't work. In many times, unrelated changes could stop another change from going forward because there was an issue with it, to a world where they're making changes sort of continuously. It's almost like a DevOps for the network world where lots of small changes are being made, and those small changes need to be made almost consistently. And so the network engineer and network architect sort of have to take a step back and try to architect and build a network, one that can sustain that level of change, but also where, and this is a key point, they servitize it. They sort of delegate some of the control to the technologists outside of the IT networking team so that they can leverage that service to build what they're trying to build. And that takes a lot of planning and architecture and engineering to build a network where you, as the engineer architect, can assure its resilience, its performance, its security, while letting others make changes to it, which is, sounds sort of scary, without having engineered the right guardrails in place and sort of, engineered a service that can be delegated. And so this hasn't been a sort of step change in the way architects and engineers are looking at networking. It's really, caused them to take a sort of step back and along with a world where there's always an easy solution for everything, that are never easy. And so on top of that, you see a lot of complexity in the network because companies keep sort of layering on and buying more things that are supposed to solve a problem that in many cases just add to the complexity, and so it requires that step back, not quick band-aids. Does that make sense, hopefully?
Yes. So, especially as they're adding on more and more, like you said, and there's more connected, how do IT teams, what is your advice for that network observability and management? Where do they start?
Yeah, well, I mean, key to any strategy that's going to drive a whole lot more change is the observability side. Like, you need to be able to see the impact of that change, so that we quickly understand if service was degraded, or generally for meeting the goal of the change. Right, the change was being made for a reason. Did we meet that goal? And then also, were there any knock-on effects? Because, lots of times a small change over here can create an issue over there that nobody could have predicted. And so that requires not just sort of local observability, but sort of generally understanding the network and being able to observe that data so we can see if there's any sort of impacts further away. And so, a lot of times, like it's sort of in the cloud world, in the cloud native world, observability is sort of a key tenet of how anything is built. So it's not something that we need to go back and think about after the fact. But in terms of, enterprise networks that have been built and managed over decades in some cases, they weren't necessarily built with that in mind. And so, it requires some effort and technology to make sure that we can observe the data we need in order to understand not just the impact of change, but are we meeting, quality of service requirements, and or are we opening up any other security vulnerabilities, or whatever the case might be. That requires that level of observability, and I think in many cases customers have several tools for sort of observing the network that are domain specific. So the security team might have their tools, the network team might have different tools that do the same thing but kind of differently. And so you also end up collecting the same data in lots of different silos, and that doesn't give you the overall picture, but also, creates tool sprawl, which nobody wants either. Again, it just sort of creates more complexity of ever doing this. So yeah, the observability side is huge to enable that change. And that includes things like being able to test, what would be the impact of this change, sort of in a predictive model as well. Giving companies more sort of intelligence on understanding change impact, blast radius, or anything along those lines as well. It always reminds me just of, there's this book by Martin Fowler on software development that is just as relevant as it is today as it was written, I don't know, I think 30 years ago. But it's just about testing and unit testing or sorry, refactoring, I should say. How do we make broad changes? And I think, like, in the preface, it says, if you can't test, stop reading, don't change it, and that sort of is what we're talking about on the observability side. If you can't understand the impact of change, then you got to solve that problem first, because you're just going to end up creating some sort of outage.
How can companies ensure network security as cyber threats grow by the day? And I don't know if AI has made an impact in this area, but what are your thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, for sure, AI brings along a bunch of challenges, and then also, opportunities to use the technology to help solve the problem. And some of the problems it brings is just, I mean, companies are now moving a ton of data, and to train models, I mean, and so there's all sorts of sort of higher level concerns around data governance and who has access to this data, and where's the data going. But also just a lot of these changes are being made rapidly. And so, quick architectural changes to enable some of this will often have sort of knock-on impacts. And part of that is just, it breaks what normal looked like. So there's going to be a lot of false flags and indicators because things are happening that weren't necessarily planned for in the organization, which always causes some confusion. And so, obviously these things can't be done in a silo. So yeah, just in any time of those sorts of rapid changes, for sure. That means we're also, companies are communicating with services that they weren't using before. There's new processes, both from like a regulatory and security side, as well from a legal side, in terms of how should we be using these services, and what does it mean that we're using a third party service with our data, and what can they do with it? And so it's anytime there's sort of rapid innovation going on with new technology, it potentially leaves open a chasm in terms of where there might be new opportunities and new vulnerabilities, and new mechanisms to exploit a company. And so, yeah, look, a lot of that goes back down to observability. It goes back down to process, And it goes back to, using the technology you have appropriately, again, as opposed to just sort of layering things on top. But, with the world of AI comes a whole new set of solutions that are both AI based to try to find this stuff, but also, for anything from data governance to everything else. And so this is what is so tough for security professionals to balance. And that is, the big joke always was, the network teams are trying to move packets, the security teams are trying to stop them. And it was never that basic, right? But, the point is, the IT, the networking teams in general, and security teams in general need to continue to become more enablers of the business as opposed to just focusing on how to stop some of this stuff from going until it goes through processes, which means they too need new processes to address this stuff. So it's a broad question. There's certainly going to be a lot of new threats and threats that can be generated faster because we now have these, code machines out there that can generate variants of code pretty rapidly with AI. So, you run into this position of, every time these new tools exist or these new capabilities exist, those that innovate faster tend to be those that are innovating without any constraint. And oftentimes those are, the bad guys who are trying to find ways to infiltrate. And so, and by the way, that's everything from, like, we're doing now phishing tests with AI generated voice from our employees and executives. And so everything from a spear phishing side to there's more tools for that team. And therefore, yeah, for sure, there's a lot of effort has to go into trying to figure out how to best secure. And that means also just closing the holes that have already existed that may not have been addressed.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, now that SD-WAN is more mainstream and edge computing, what advice do you have for business leaders as far as maintaining reliable performance and security across the networks?
Yeah, it's just another, yeah, I mean, for sure, SD-WAN is fairly pervasive right now. I don't know, I think, well, I know, I mean, at the end of the day, a lot of that industry was driven because companies like Microsoft were moving their customer base to Office 365, now Microsoft 365, and all of a sudden, direct internet access from remote sites was important to ensure performance, and it caused a sort of major shift in enterprise networking and how data egresses from any company. And also enabled work from home and a bunch in remote work in general in ways that were way less performed before. And so, yeah, and so a lot of companies, with the advent of SD-WAN and certainly if implemented appropriately, you're no longer reliant on a single service provider. There's multiple mechanisms to keep that connection going. The fact that the network will be available is less of a question with appropriately deployed SD-WAN. But now the requirements are changing again with just the volume of data, and it becomes difficult to enforce things like quality of service for critical protocols and communication if the pipes are being flooded by AI workloads and data sets and stuff like that. And so some of our customers are out there building brand new networks just for data as it goes to AI and training models. And so I think enterprise architects will be looking at updated requirements in terms of quality of service in general and bandwidth, and this network modernization, which basically means all of us need a whole lot more bandwidth in many cases. And so yeah, I think bandwidth at some point was taken for granted, and I say that with a grain of salt. Point is, we're no longer sitting here with calculators trying to figure out if we can support a new application on this link because we only have a 64K ISDN line. Those days are long gone. Bandwidth is we take it for granted these days. But I think that's changing again because the pipes are being filled up. So the good news is with these SD-WAN deployments that many companies have these days, You're not looking at completely re-architecting from that perspective again. Because you have something now that is addressable and changeable and isn't sort of locked in with the service provider for the network itself, which just gives companies a whole lot more options.
Wonderful. Well, looking forward to the future, say maybe 1 or 2 years down the road, what do you envision are going to be some of the changes or the impact of network operations?
I think what we're going to end up seeing is a whole lot more automation. And I don't just mean automation of the changes themselves, but automation of the health of the network. A lot of companies are still, for good reason, not ready to sort of allow technology to remediate or make changes to the network automatically. They want to know what it's going to do ahead of time, or at least press the button, go, or there might be change orders or change paperwork they need and approvals to make those sorts of changes. I think all of that's going to go away as we move forward. Not all of it, but some of that's going to go away. And there's going to be a lot more automated remediation, automated bandwidth expansion. The things that we've done to applications. If you go build cloud native applications, you build them so that they can scale horizontally. So they you don't need to sort of build for peak load. That the applications themselves know how to scale and can do that automatically within certain constraints. And I think you're going to see networks going in the same place where the network itself will be able to remediate, will be able to scale, will be able to change paths if there's issues and disruptions. And so I just think we're going to a world where as we servitize that network, we're also going to have networks that are, I guess the right term is self-healing, but I mean well more than self-healing. I mean, that are able to meet the demands of the business, whether that again means sort of scaling or healing or whatever the case, without human intervention. And there's lots of humans behind that, of course, building that, making sure it's working. But those sort of changes throughout the day will start happening automatically.
Wonderful. Well, I always like to end my show by asking what is one key takeaway you could leave our audience with today?
Uh, don't change something if you can't see it.
All right. Good advice. Thank you so much for coming on the show and sharing your insights with us.
All right. Thank you for having me.
And thank you to our audience. Share what was the most interesting to you. And if you have any questions, leave those in the comments. Till the next podcast, have a wonderful day.